Welcome to an all new season of Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. The federal government may be heading toward a shutdown that will likely disrupt many services, squeeze workers and royal politics, and force another round of confrontation over jobs and freedom in the nation's capital. My guest this week is Professor Yohuru Williams, Distinguished University Chair of History and founding director of the Racial Justice Institute at the University of St. Thomas, and co author of the new book, More Than a Dream: The Radical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Professor Williams, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. Now, 60 years ago, more than 200,000 demonstrators took part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in the nation's capital. The march was obviously very successful in pressuring the administration of JFK to initiate a strong federal civil rights bill in Congress. Today, Congress faces a new challenge: lack of political will, which was probably present 60 years ago. Can we talk a little bit about why jobs and freedom seems to be a recurring theme? Another way of sort of thinking about this, why this is a recurring theme in the nation's capital today?
It's such a great question, Dr. Johnson. It's interwoven into the history of Black America. On this idea that if we think about the legacy of slavery, Black people came here as enforced labor. And so with the Civil War, immediately comes the question: what is the status of the freed persons going to be? How do you negotiate the livelihood of people who were once enslaved and not compensated for their labor? So jobs and freedom, labor and civil rights have always been intimately connected. Part of the legacy of the failure of the Civil War and Reconstruction in particular, was a denial of autonomy for Black people and ensuring their ability to negotiate fair labor contracts. And we see that consistently throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, well into the civil rights movement. So when we think about the March for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, it resonates that Dr. King and others are really centering that around the idea that that's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. What it changed in those 100 years around issues of jobs and freedom, economic sustainability, and political freedom.
I want to stay on the current stalemate in Washington, D.C. for a moment. Millions of workers face delayed paychecks, right? If the government shuts down, including many of the roughly 2 million military personnel. Many people of color are sort of part of this cadre. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what you think is what is the role of government in jobs and the freedom movement today? And at the risk of um, again, economically displacing so many people, what is the job and role of government?
We think about the government as the balancer, the equalizer in many ways, the protector in some ways. And so, for example, this week, the discussion of President Biden joining the picket line for the auto workers is a good example of how historically, when we think about the federal government, it's been as an opponent of labor, organized labor in particular, and this being a very different moment. For the government in particular, though, when we think about the shutdown, it'll be hard to disentangle this from the legacy of white supremacy. Part of the anti-government impulse that you see that bubbles up from the extreme right, for example, has always been predicated on this resistance against inclusivity. And if we think about the government shutdown today, the idea that government is too big, that the government intervenes too forcefully into the lives of people, so on and so forth, it is framed as this response against government intrusion, but a lot of that is anti-Blackness that's dressed up as anti-government sentiment. And so we really have to name that anti-Blackness. We have to name that white supremacist impulse. And we have to situate our conversations about civil rights and racial justice within the context of a government shutdown, which would mean a shutdown of access to goods and services, as well as the intervention of the government around issues of racial justice, which are central to people of color, namely Black people, African Americans, and others.
Thank you for naming it and labeling it for what it really is. And I think a lot of people, political pundits included, sort of dance around what is, right? So a lot of civil servants, a lot of people in the defense, these are people of color, but nobody really says that. It's sort of masked in this language around, no, it's overspending, it's government, it's just a general government shutdown. So thank you for that. Can we talk a little bit about the overlooked work of socialist organizations in this movement?
They're actually critical. And I think part of the problem here is that the legacy or the holdover from the civil rights movement of this staunch anti communism, which was a big part and a big fear on the part of Americans in that moment, which civil rights activists themselves worried about, at least those on the national stage. People like A. Philip Randolph, and of course, Bayard Rustin, and certainly the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But this more radical tradition, these more radical influences within the movement are there: the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, Black communists in particular. And they want their voices to be heard, more militant and radical voices within the movement. We often, for example, talk about this move from civil rights to Black power. But as Peniel Joseph writes about in his book, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, the civil rights and Black power movements are actually parallel movements. So they're existing at the same time. Black power doesn't become a thing in 1966 when Stokely Carmichael makes that call in Greenwood, Mississippi. Black power existed along civil rights. And there were always more radical voices, more progressive voices who were calling for much more than the federal government, more than, as Ella Baker famously put it, was bigger than a hamburger. And you pick up some of those more radical influences, not on the mainstream kind of platform of the march itself, but within the local organizing that's taking place around the March on Washington, as those individuals also see this as an opportunity to elevate the agenda, and to make some of the things that they believe that are central to human freedom and Black freedom part of that agenda.
Hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the precarious force of Black women in this movement. Why did you think it was important to re explore the protests' radical roots and the long ignored role of Black women organizers on the ground? Did Black women protesters reposition the movement in any way? And how did they really get results? What type of results ultimately did we see carried forward because of the role of Black women?
Well, they're actually essential to the movement. And I think what ends up happening in the way that we frame the movement is we look at it as kind of king led and king dominated. That's problematic. So we don't talk about the grassroots to begin with. And then within the context of the grassroots, we very rarely focus on the contribution of Black women. Black women are part of this organizing tradition within the African American community that goes back generations. In fact, Charles Payne, in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, wrote memorably about it in this way: men may have led the movement, but women organized. And if you have no organizing tradition, you have nothing to lead. And so these very incredible cadre of Black female organizers, whose names are less familiar to us, were integral at the local level, at the grassroots level, in putting together the teams of people that went down to DC to demonstrate. But it wasn't just their ability to organize around the march, the mobilizing around the march. It was also the fact that these women headed up civil rights organizations in these local communities. So as we begin to tease out this kind of deeper history of civil rights, it's not just the story of someone like a Rosa Parks, who had a long history of activism long before she refused to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus. It's women like Gloria Richardson, who heads up the Cambridge movement in Maryland. It's people like Ella Anderson from Bridgeport, Connecticut, whose name will be unfamiliar to the vast majority of Americans, but who was part of the at the forefront of civil rights agitation in the state of Connecticut. And so when we kind of look at that history more deeply, what we discover is the integral role that women played. Unfortunately, at the national level, those women are silenced by the mainstream movement. And that's part of the problem and what we wanted to recover in this book. We, in our contemporary moment, have a Black Lives Matter movement, which is led by and spearheaded by Black women. And we see this incredible organizing tradition, which for some people seems to be a departure from that history. Actually, it's an affirmation of this organizing tradition that women led. They were invisible, but they were there and they were an integral part of the movement. Their ideas really frame the movement and continue to frame the way that we think about racial justice and civil rights and Black equality in America.
Let's lift up the voices of some of the names of some of these women. You write that female activists, people like Pauli Murray, Anna Arnold Hedgemon, actually called out A. Philip Randolph, Dr. Martin Luther King, to, as in a very serious conversation in terms of what needs to happen, almost forcing them up their backs against the wall to sort of rethink, that, we have to be a part, our voices need to be heard here. Ultimately, you write, Marilee Evers was added to the program to include a tribute to Black women. Tell us a little bit, what do you know about that conversation, that confrontational conversation that took place with A. Philip Randolph and Dr. Martin Luther King and some of these women?
Well, as you know, Dr. Johnson, Black women have always been asked to sacrifice uh, the issues around gender in support of the larger questions of racial liberation. And that's why Black feminism is so important. It's kind of centering Black female voices and talking about the unique experience of Black women, separate and distinct from that of Black men and of white women. So, Black feminism is very important in the way that we think about what happened at the March on Washington. You've got Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who's there for the National Council of Churches, the lone woman on the organizing committee, who has to navigate the sexism and patriarchy of trying to move the march organizers in the direction of simply acknowledging the presence and influence of Black female organizers. But she has to do that also kind of recognizing that she's operating within the limitations of being Black and female. And so you see her do that by ultimately getting Randolph and the other leaders to agree to a tribute to Negro women, which is, a little bit of a throwaway, but it's better than nothing. And in that moment, it at least acknowledges the unique and important role that Black women have played. At the same time, you've got Dorothy Height, who's one of the big six, who's putting pressure on Randolph and the other leaders, and who's also organizing behind the scenes. And Pauli Murray, whom I actually love, who represents this intersectional identity because not only is she Black and female, she's also part of the LGBTQ plus community. And she is going to write Randolph both privately and call him out publicly and make the case that she does not want to be a part of any movement that doesn't recognize that it is as wrong to discriminate against someone based on their sex as it is their race, and not to recognize the unique position that Black women occupy because of the double bonds of racism and sexism. So you have these women making that case and making it forcefully. But at the same time, Dr. Johnson, what I love is that you also have newspapers at the time. There's an article by a gentleman, James L. Hicks, that we include that talks about the important role of women. It wasn't like it was hidden. You've got journalists at the time that are saying Black women are the backbone of this movement. And they're kind of celebrating that even as these women are ignored on the national stage. The final compromise is that they offer this tribute to Negro women, to Black women. And it's satisfying to some of the organizers like Dr. Arnold Hedgeman in a sense that it is a recognition. And if we think about the word tribute, it's a statement of admiration, respect, and recognition. What it is not, and Arnold Hedgeman calls this out, as does Pauli Murray, is a statement of equality. And what they demanded was equality. And one of the things that Pauli Murray says is, Rustin, King, others, if we don't tackle the issue of gender equality along with racial inequality now, we're simply going to be back here in 10 years. We're going to have to do this again because it's not just jobs and freedom, it's also gender justice that's interwoven in this. And Black women occupy a very important cog in that conversation because if you're going to talk about the most oppressed, those who are feeling this in the most acute way, it's Black women. Again, great question. I think we still find ourselves in a moment where Black women certainly are much more visible in the struggle for civil rights and are continuing that organizing tradition, but still find themselves marginalized in the way that we think about racial justice in this country. I think a very good example, even within BLM, which is women led, and certainly a part of that organizing tradition, is how often we talk about Black men who are the subject of police brutality, but how we fail to talk about Black women and their encounters with police and racial justice in that way, or the LGBTQ plus community in that way. And so gender is actually essential in the way that we think about racial justice. But in more recent years, we're beginning to see a new cadre of leaders, a new generation of leaders who say, we have to kind of break with that old tradition, that respectability politics that mandated that the only time that we mattered is if we fit into the mainstream narrative about cisgendered, um, you know, uh, individuals who kind of fit the norm of respectable politics. We reject human life, Black life matters, no matter where it is on the spectrum. And so we have to kind of push for that. And that's what I celebrate in BLM. I think when we think about the evolution of the civil rights movement, and again, we talk about the difference between that 1963 moment and today, It's that this generation of activists says, we're not going to replicate those mistakes. We have to take that on and acknowledge it. We have to name it. We have to organize and mobilize around it.
The 1963 March on Washington had several precedents, drawing attention to the exclusion of African Americans from big sectors of the labor market, for example. Can we talk a little bit about what the marchers actually agreed on?
It's interesting because one could argue not much behind the scenes, but they are able to come to consensus about what a national program will be in order to carry this out. Within the among the organizers themselves, there's deep disagreement. You've got the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for example, who are very critical of the Kennedy administration, who want more from the federal government, and who are dissatisfied with the more moderate tone that Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph and others have taken, and particularly Roy Wilkins and the NAACP, Whitney Young and the Urban League have taken with regard to pressuring the administration. You've got people like Malcolm X on the sidelines who actually shows up in Washington, D.C. for the march, not to participate, but to kind of poke fun and call out what he sees as this huge inconsistency of the idea that you could have people march peacefully for freedom and for equality when they're being denied that violently throughout the United States. But then you also have this consensus that emerges that this moment is important, even within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This idea that we're going to support Mr. Randolph's dream. We're going to kind of get behind this and support this because, what do we have to lose? This is still an opportunity to articulate in a meaningful way in the nation's capital, our view of what freedom and equality should be. And it doesn't take away anything, their ability to kind of articulate those dissenting opinions in other spaces, but they do kind of get on board in terms of a national agenda. And there's some censoring that takes place. There's some mandating that takes place from the National Coordinating Committee of the march. Signs have to be approved, for example. They want to make sure that people are on message. There's pressure that's placed on speakers about their tone and some of the, John Lewis famously has his speech altered at the 11th hour because there are parts of it that are objectionable to supporters of Kennedy within the march. And so those elements are there, but it doesn't mean that, even in the aftermath of the march itself, John Lewis is in the media talking about how his speech has been censored and sharing with people very clearly what his concerns were, what SNCC's concerns were about the federal government not taking a more proactive role in protecting Black life. One of the things that I think is compelling, and I'd ask your viewers or listeners to think about is go back and look at those images of those signs at the March on Washington. It's a march for jobs and freedom, but a lot of those signs say, end police brutality now. So they're talking about those issues echo in our contemporary moment.
There is a big debate right now, especially in Florida, about curriculum and pedagogy. Why do you think our knowledge of American history remains so incomplete? Why do you think, as an American or as Americans focus on these final 5 minutes of King's speech, that works, but everything else is not is not connecting, is not resonating?
I think primarily because it requires nothing of us. And I think that's what's so threatening about not just American history, but Black history in particular. And then if we really drill down and talk about the history of Black women in particular, in conversation with the national dialogue over civics and social justice and racial justice, it becomes even more evident that we don't live up to our ideals. American has a civil theology that's based on the preamble to the Constitution and the ideals that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Those things have never measured up when we talk about Black people, and they're certainly even more stark in how they fall short when we talk about the experience of Black women. So teaching that history in its full complexity requires us then to reimagine our republic and the foundations of our liberty and equality to say, what are we doing that would actually ensure that we meet those ideals? And I think that's why it's so threatening and scary for certain people. We were in Florida. We went down in May on the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education for a teach-in, Teach the Truth with the Institute for Common Power. And the reason we went was to kind of affirm and assert the importance of history in that space, to reclaim that space. And we led by talking about, Brown versus Board of Education. We think about the tributaries to that case. These are Black girls, Black women, Black girls who are some of the plaintiffs in those cases. So gender, again, I think on full display in that moment. But more importantly, in the way that we think about this, it was an opportunity to remind Governor DeSantis and others that this history is important because America's a work in progress. That's also the message of the first two-thirds of King's speech in 1963. We have a blank check as a result of the unfinished business of emancipation and equality. And the only way that we can actually get there to reach that beloved community is if we honestly face our history and move toward practicing our ideals. And we can't do that unless we look at those who are on the margins of the margins. That's the only way to get there. That's what this history calls people to do. But unfortunately, Americans love a tragedy with a happy ending. We have a sitcom understanding of our history. We want everything wrapped up in 30 minutes like a sitcom. And so we go for the easy. Dr. King said, I have a dream, and then everybody was equal. Instead of Pauli Murray said, I contest that dream, because if we don't look at this in all of its complexity, we're not dealing with the more intricate and complex problems of the school, prisons, and racial inequality and gender injustice. And so the very things that led to the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis in 2020.
The March on Washington was not universally embraced, and you sort of touched a little bit about on that. It was condemned by the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, who referred to it as a farce on Washington. Now, he wasn't, Nation of Islam and Malcolm X weren't the only critics of the March on Washington, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what the naysayers wanted, the people who weren't in agreement with this vision. What what would have brought them on board?
Or there are kind of three things there. There are those who participate. One of my favorite chapters is about this bus that comes out of Harlem, a core bus, Congress of Racial Equality bus, where there's a bitter debate on board by more radical voices, those who would have been more associated with Malcolm X and Black Power, who say, they tell the white demonstrators on that bus, you might be going to DC, but we have very different agenda. And if things go south, don't expect us to have your back because for us, this is about revolution. So there are those who believe that anything short of a revolution is going to be incomplete. I think that's part of Malcolm X's critique as well, why he calls it the farce on Washington. Whoever heard of a nonviolent revolution? And Malcolm is looking through that through the lens of history, but also looking at that in terms of practical terms. And he says this just a few weeks after the March on Washington ends, after those 4 little girls were killed at the 16th Baptist Church. You had this nonviolent demonstration for freedom. You walk away declaring a victory, and then you have 4 little girls who are killed in a church on Sunday morning. That's not a revolution. What that is a continuation of the injustice that led you to DC in the first place. And then ultimately, even after you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's incomplete because you got to come back a year later and get a Voting Rights Act of 1965 to kind of continue that work. I think the last critique that you're getting are from those folks like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who believe that you have to put more pressure on the federal government. The federal government needs to step up. And one of the things that's important about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s is just like the Civil War and Reconstruction. In fact, Dr. Arnold Taylor at Howard University used to say one of the convenient ways to think about the civil rights movement is as a second Civil War. What made the Civil War so important is that for the first time, the federal government came on board and supported the cause of freedom for Black people, and that was important. Lincoln may have come along reluctantly, but ultimately the Lincoln administration came along and emancipation followed suit. The Kennedy administration doesn't adopt civil rights early on, but what the March on Washington does, despite the fear, is it forces the government's hand and it articulates a view of civil rights that then make it difficult for the Kennedy administration to see itself not as an agent of challenging the injustice of what's happening in places like Birmingham and Tallahassee throughout the country. So I think those are, as we think about the resistance to the march, that's some of it. And then just generalized fear, including the Kennedy administration that thinks that violence is going to erupt in DC. And I think that violence is going to come from the demonstrators themselves. They fundamentally do not understand the concept of nonviolent direct action protest.
I want to invite you into a little bit of the political fray. The Republican Party is in the middle of their primary. U.S. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina is one candidate. I want to invite you to weigh in on a recent comment that he made regarding poverty and race. He says we don't have Black people, we don't have Black poverty or white poverty. We just have poverty in America. What are your thoughts on this? What can you give the viewers some context to understanding why the watering down of what is?
Well, I'll say this, and I don't mind going into the fray in this way. Any candidate that begins their candidacy from Fort Sumter, clearly I begin to question their understanding of history and symbolism. For Tim Scott to launch his campaign from that place, which holds such significance in terms of the reification of white supremacy and what it represents in terms of the Civil War and the lost cause, was very problematic. This notion of a colorblind society that we see kind of elevated in his rhetoric around poverty there is problematic. And yet I want to, make this crystal clear. There's a reason in 68 that Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference are drawing people to DC to deal with the issue of poverty. And they're bringing together a coalition of not just African Americans, but white and indigenous folks who are suffering from poverty. But they're very clear. Again, you have to look at this on the margins of the margins. Poverty in this country has a shade, and it's Black. And so if you're going to tackle poverty for everyone, you got to tackle it in its most persistent and in its most insidious form, and that is racialized poverty. So, yes, Tim Scott, there is white poverty and there is poverty in Appalachia, but it's not informed by white supremacy and racial injustice and policies and historic policies, practices, and procedures, which continue to create this iron tight cage of poverty and inequality, which Dr. King talked about not just at the March on Washington, but in his letter from a Birmingham jail. My message to Tim Scott and other politicals across the country who like to invoke the symbolism of the movement and not the substances, please read and quote the whole thing before you do. Because if you don't, what you do, or you're doing a disservice. People complain about CRT, critical race theory. I like to talk about the other CRT, critical thinking. And I wish more of these people would do more critical thinking about what they share. It's irresponsible to say or to deny that there's not a racialized component to poverty in this country in 2023.
Professor Williams is a distinguished university chair of history and founding director of Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas and co-author of the new book, More Than a Dream, The Radical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
You as well. Thank you so much for your work, Dr. Johnson.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or the show exclusively on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.